Welcome back. Today we're diving into a systemic analysis of Harley-Davidson, looking at the trade-offs between its Made in America identity and, well, all the consequences that followed.
This is a really robust piece of work. It weaves together the mechanics, the economics, the culture, but I think we can sharpen the causal links, really dial in the architecture of the argument.
Okay, so let's start with that central hinge. The material lays out these two parallel stories. On one hand, you have the rigid industrial path Harley was on, mostly from its military days, right?
Right, the WLA model, the chain drives, all that.
And on the other, you have this incredibly successful pivot to selling the outlaw lifestyle. The thing is, we need to explicitly connect them to show how the failure of the industrial system was the reason for that cultural pivot.
That is the crucial link. Right now, it feels a little like one thing happened, and then another thing happened. We see the military standardization, which gave them scale but also made them rigid.
And then we see the weekend rebel with the six-figure salary buying into the fantasy.
Exactly. The weakness is that it could be read as just a really clever marketing campaign, not as a direct, almost desperate consequence of their industrial system completely falling apart.
Wait, so you're saying the outlaw image wasn't just a smart move, but maybe the only one they had left once the bikes couldn't compete on a technical level?
Precisely. So, I think the first big point is that the analysis needs to strengthen the causal link between Harley-Davidson's reliance on military standardization and the eventual commodification of the outlaw image as a necessary financial defense. The weakness, as you said, is that you detail the technical constraints, the engineering path that led to them becoming obsolete, but you don't quite land the punch that this forced the financial pivot.
Right. Like when the Honda CB750 shows up in the late 60s?
That's the moment. It just lays bare the Japanese technological superiority. Suddenly, Harley's system is a huge liability, and that liability is what forces them to stop selling motorcycles and start selling an experience at a premium.
So the suggestion here is to reframe that entire cultural critique. The selling of the outlaw image wasn't just a pivot, it was a survival mechanism. We have to show that they did it to justify the high price tag when the technical quality just wasn't there anymore.
That's it. The financialization of that 1%er mythology, that was the firewall they built because the factory floor was, well, on fire. And to make that stick, we need to use the specific, measurable points of failure.
I can see that. We can make it much more concrete. Instead of just mentioning the old WWI-era WLA, we contrast its limitations, like the 4-inch ground clearance that just boxed them in for decades, with the financialization of the outlaw image that became the whole new value proposition.
Yes, and you have to use that devastating data point. Before '82, over half of the bikes coming off the assembly line failed inspection.
50%.
A 50% failure rate. At the same time, Japanese bikes were at 5% or less. That technical collapse necessitated a non-technical, purely emotional appeal.
Which explains that incredible 75% repeat buyer rate.
It had to be an emotional appeal, loyalty, lifestyle, the hog clubs, the branded jackets. The brand had to become this unquantifiable cultural thing because the quantifiable metric, the quality of the machine, had failed them.
That's a much stronger connection. The poor quality literally forced the cultural story to become the entire business model. So, what happens when that exact culture, the thing that saved them, starts to work against their future survival?
And that is the most powerful unresolved tension in the entire piece. I think the second point for refinement is this. The concluding tension between the brand's hypermasculine core identity and the necessity of attracting new, diverse demographics presents the most powerful, unresolved theme and requires sharper definition.
Okay, let's unpack that. The material points out the demographic crisis. The baby boomers are aging out, spending less, and so Harley has to reach out to new groups: women, Hispanic riders, the LGBTQ+ community.
Right. But the risk here is framing it as a simple marketing problem. Like, oh, they just aren't good at marketing to new people. It's not that. It's an intrinsic, almost paralyzing consequence of their historical success.
Because that success was built on forging this very specific, hypermasculine soldier/laborer identity.
Exactly. Rooted in post-war vet culture and the whole 1%er myth. And that's the very thing that's now limiting them. The source material even notes the core writer was likely to leave the brand if it got associated with, say, LGBTQ+ customers.
And the exclusive clique mentality that female writers run into at dealerships.
It's all part of it. So the suggestion, the way to really sharpen this, is to frame the conclusion around this fundamental constraint. The historical cultural success, the moat they built, has now become a cage.
A cage that's stopping them from getting to new markets.
It's a perfect trade-off. If they stick to the hypermasculine ideal, they keep that core loyal base, but they face demographic collapse. It's a guarantee. But if they diversify too much, they risk brand dilution, and that same loyal base abandons them anyway. It's a real catch-22.
We can make that so much more concrete by using the data you've already sourced. You juxtapose the fact that the average owner is affluent, earning over $80,000 a year.
So it's a luxury good.
Right, it's a luxury good, but the fantasy they're buying is rooted in this blue-collar, militaristic habitus.
Use that exact paradox. The moment you promote inclusivity, you push the electric live wire, you focus on women and minorities, you run headfirst into that core writer's likely dislike of being associated with those new groups. That right there is the definition of your past success constraining your future.
The cultural pivot that saved them from the industrial collapse has now basically mortgaged their future growth.
That's a great way to put it.
Global strategy and that American identity.
Right. We have to treat the offshoring question not just as a modern issue, but as a historic consequence of how they chose to scale.
So the topic sentence would be something like, the material must elevate the current global manufacturing paradox, offshoring versus the Made in America promise, from a modern issue to a core, historic consequence of scale and political constraints.
I think that's exactly it.
The analysis already touches on the backlash. The unions, the IAM and USW getting angry about moving production of models like the Pan American Sportster overseas.
To Thailand, Brazil, India, officially to get around tariffs and into Asian markets.
But the weakness is that it doesn't quite connect that modern decision back to the original constraint. The fact that they scaled up through military dependence made them reliant on external political and economic forces from the very beginning.
The American icon status was, in a way, functionally unstable from the start.
So the suggestion is to weave in that labor history and the company's reliance on politics from WWI contracts all the way to the 80s tariffs against Japan to show this isn't a new problem.
It's a systemic constraint. The trade-off becomes sacrificing the authenticity of the Made in America story for pure global economic viability. And it shows that these offshoring decisions aren't just, corporate greed. They're shaped by these path-dependent constraints. The flat U.S. market, the tariffs.
It reframes it from a simple moral question about jobs to a systemic one about survival. And it really proves the long-term cost of their historical path.
To make that point land, you should use the most contemporary examples. Focus on the contradiction. You have the CEO, Jochen Zaitz, saying, at some point in time, Harley-Davidson will be all electric.
So they're sacrificing their core technical heritage, the V-twin engine.
Right. And you put that right next to the decision to move manufacturing of their current core models overseas, and then you add the union quote, calling it a kick in the teeth to American workers.
That juxtaposition is powerful. It shows they're sacrificing both their technical heritage and their manufacturing identity just to get future market access.
It proves that the original military-industrial path, which gave them stability for decades, ultimately guaranteed that the pure made-in-American identity couldn't last.
It's the perfect example of the icon having to be dissolved globally for the corporation to survive.
That's the core insight.
Okay, so to sum up, this critique has really been about sharpening the focus on these systemic constraints. We've identified 3 big opportunities to really nail down the causal links and the trade-offs.
First, sharpen that causal argument. Explicitly link the industrial rigidity, use that 50% failure rate as the direct cause of the cultural pivot into selling the outlaw identity.
Second, frame the demographic crisis not as a marketing failure, but as this paralyzing tension. The brand's cultural moat has become a cage that's preventing them from expanding.
And finally, elevate that whole globalization paradox. Link the modern offshoring back to the historical political instability that came with their dependence on the military and their need for scale. Show that the American icon identity was always fragile and is now dissolving under economic pressure.
These refinements will add so much rigor to the argument. It'll really elevate the conclusion that the Harley-Davidson system is this profound, unresolved story of constraints and consequences. As always, we invite you to refine the material based on this critique and send it back to us for a follow-up. Until next time.